We live in a world where answers are a click away. But for centuries, knowledge was a luxury. If you were poor, you couldn't read. If you were curious, you were silenced. This is how one invention broke that silence and rewrote history. Before the press, there was silence. Not peace, not ignorance, but a silence made of distance, of restriction, of control. If you were born in 1200, 1300, even 1400, you would most likely never read a single sentence. You wouldn't need to, and the world preferred you didn't. Books weren't books, they were treasures, rare, precious, and unreachable, each one copied by hand, ink on parchment, quill on skin, line by line, word by word. Not to spread ideas, but to preserve them. Exactly, repeatedly, carefully. It could take 3 years to produce one Bible, and it might be chained to a monastery wall, so no one could steal it. Not because it was sacred, but because it was irreplaceable. The words inside were written in Latin, a language most people never heard spoken aloud, let alone understood. And so, across much of Europe, the vast majority of people lived their lives without ever reading, without ever questioning, without ever imagining a world different from the one they were born into. But that doesn't mean they didn't want to. There were children who asked questions their fathers couldn't answer, wives who learned verses by heart from their husbands' sermons, merchants who listened to stories and remembered every detail, people who hungered for knowledge, but had no way to reach it. Because knowledge was kept high, and they were taught to stay low. Education was for the few. Books were for the few. And the right to think differently, to dream of a better world, was granted only to those who already lived in one. Ideas lived, but didn't spread. Truth existed, but traveled slowly. Stories were born, but died in whispers. This was the age of silence, not because humanity had nothing to say, but because the world wasn't yet ready to listen. But change was coming, and it wouldn't arrive with fanfare, or kings, or war. It would begin with a press, and with it, a quiet click that would echo through history. But silence never lasts forever. Even the deepest silence eventually meets a voice bold enough to break it. In the German city of Mainz, sometime around the year 1440, that voice belonged to a man named Johannes Gutenberg. He wasn't a king. He wasn't a scholar. He wasn't even rich. He was the son of a merchant, a man of tools and trade, of ink and metal and borrowed time. He had no army, no land, no legacy. But he had something else. He had a question. What if words didn't have to be so rare? And slowly, he began to build an answer. Gutenberg wasn't the first to dream of copying faster. The Chinese had printed with woodblocks centuries before. Scribes had tried everything, from faster ink to better pens. But no one had solved the problem Gutenberg saw: how to make thought repeatable, reproducible, reliable, and available to anyone. His genius wasn't just invention, it was combination. He took the screw press used by winemakers. He took molten lead and crafted individual letters. He shaped type that could be moved, arranged, rearranged, reused. And then he added ink. Thick, sticky ink that wouldn't smear, pressed against paper, again and again and again. Each turn of the press printed a page, not a draft, not a sketch, but a perfect, permanent replica. For the first time in history, words could be mass-produced. It wasn't easy. He worked in secret, afraid of being copied, sabotaged, or shut down. He borrowed money. He fell into debt. He lost control of his own press before it became famous. But the press didn't care who owned it. It only cared about turning. And once it began to turn, the world began to shift with it. In 1455, the first major printed book appeared. The Gutenberg Bible, 180 copies, each one identical. Each one a quiet rebellion against the centuries before. Printers across Europe rushed to build their own presses. By 1500, over 20 million books had been printed, not by monks in silence, but by machines in motion. The machine had no voice, but it gave one to the world, and the silence that had lasted for centuries. It didn't vanish all at once, but it began to crack. And at first, it was just a sound, the turning of gears, the pressing of ink, a quiet rhythm behind workshop doors. But soon it became something more. It became noise. And the world, unprepared, began to listen. Some saw it as a miracle. A Bible printed in days instead of decades. A book that could be owned by a merchant or read by a child. It felt impossible, unnatural even. To some, it felt dangerous, because for the first time, knowledge no longer needed permission. What had once been slow, sacred, and controlled was now fast, repeatable, and free. And not everyone was ready for that. The church, once the gatekeeper of Scripture, now faced a future where anyone could read holy texts, not in Latin, but in their own language, without priests, without translators, without interpretation. Rulers feared it too, because where ideas could spread, doubt could follow. And doubt was harder to silence than people. But it was already too late. The press was spreading faster than fear could contain it. Printers popped up across Europe. In France, Italy, the Low Countries, England, cities echoed with the hiss of ink and the snap of pages. And into those pages poured everything. Poems, sermons, laws, scientific theories, personal letters, satire, protest. The world had begun to speak, loudly, all at once, and not just the elite. The people, those who had once been told what to believe, now read what others believed, and what they themselves could believe. From silent obedience came printed rebellion. From single voices came movements. And from a simple machine came something unstoppable. But power, even in ink, always has a price. Ideas that uplift can also divide. Words that heal can also wound. And the press, for all its beauty, would soon carry not just truth, but propaganda. Not just enlightenment, but unrest. The machine had given the world a voice, but it had not told it what to say. And in that space, between inspiration and chaos, history would turn again. When the press began to spread, so did the truth, and so did the conflict. Because once the world had a voice, it started asking questions. And some of those questions had no answers the old powers were willing to give. In 1517, just over 60 years after Gutenberg's first Bible rolled off the press, a monk named Martin Luther walked up to the doors of a church in Wittenberg and nailed a list of complaints to it. 95 of them against corruption, against indulgences, against the very institution that had defined truth for over 1,000 years. Before the press, that act would have vanished. A bold local protest, a forgotten page of rebellion. But now those 95 theses could be copied, multiplied, read by thousands, then by millions. And suddenly, Europe cracked. The Protestant Reformation exploded across the continent. Not because of war, not because of weapons, because of words, printed in the people's language, passed hand to hand, read aloud in taverns, debated in markets, hidden under floorboards. The church tried to contain it, burning pamphlets, banning books, declaring war on heresy. But for every book burned, 10 more were printed. The press had outpaced the fire, and it didn't stop at religion. Science followed next. Copernicus printed the theory that the Earth moved around the sun. Galileo expanded it, and for the first time, people questioned not just heaven, but everything. The press made thinkers dangerous, because now their thoughts could multiply. In France, in England, in the Dutch Republic. Ideas became weapons. Philosophy became fuel. And the next revolutions were no longer spiritual. They were political. From monarchies to movements. From divine right to human rights. Revolutions born in printing shops. freedom born in footnotes. But not everyone welcomed the noise. The press didn't choose sides. It printed truth. It printed lies. It printed scripture and satire, poetry and propaganda. And once the words were out, they could not be pulled back. Some called it progress, others chaos. But either way, no one could deny it anymore. The world had changed, not because of armies, not because of kings, but because of paper and ink and people who refused to be silent anymore. The revolution had begun, and history had turned. There were places where reading was discouraged, where books in certain languages were banned, where stories were filtered and history edited. But people still found ways. They always do. Across Eastern Europe, book smugglers carried pages over frozen borders, Lithuanian texts hidden beneath coats, religious pamphlets sealed under false floors, entire alphabets preserved in motion, never in defiance, only in hope. These weren't rebels. They were teachers, clerks, parents, men and women who believed that knowledge wasn't something to be rationed. Yes, they were watched. Yes, some were arrested. But they kept going, not because they sought conflict, but because they saw silence as the greater risk. What they smuggled weren't just books, but futures. Books that taught children to read. Books that held forgotten dialects. Books that reminded people of who they were or who they could be. And slowly, these efforts left a mark. Small towns with no libraries began to share pages by candlelight. Villages passed dog-eared novels from home to home. The student would read something her parents had never been allowed to. The world didn't change overnight. But it did change, because people quietly moved stories where they weren't supposed to go. It didn't happen overnight. There was no thunderclap, no single morning when the world woke up literate. But slowly, like light creeping through shutters at dawn, reading began to spread. First in cities, then in villages, then across borders. Not just among scholars and kings, but among farmers, merchants, apprentices, children. For centuries, reading had been a ritual of the few. Now, it was becoming a rhythm of the many. Books, once guarded behind monastery walls, began appearing in homes and marketplaces. Schools opened their doors to those who had never been welcome. The printing press no longer whispered to cathedrals. It spoke to streets. A man could now teach himself to read and change his life. A mother could pass down more than stories. She could pass down pages. A child could hear voices from centuries past and feel as though they were speaking just to him. And with each word read, something else began to take root. Curiosity, confidence. The sense that knowledge was no longer a gift, but a right. Villages once known only for silence gained libraries. Towns once ruled by superstition began to question. People once expected only to obey began to imagine, to wonder, to think. This was the birth of literacy. But it was more than just decoding letters on a page. It was the beginning of something spiritual, something social, something dangerous to those who had once held all the power. Because when people begin to read, they begin to ask. And when they begin to ask, they are no longer easy to rule. The printing press had launched revolutions, but it was literacy that would carry those revolutions forward, generation after generation after generation, word after word. And it was happening everywhere. In candle-lit kitchens, in corners of crowded streets, in makeshift classrooms and fields and ferryboats. The world was learning a new language, the language of thought, of history, of possibility. And the greatest transformation wasn't just in books. It was in people. The press didn't just launch revolutions. It did something quieter and stranger. It rewired how people understood the world. Before print, truth was simple. It came from your priest, your ruler, your village elder. It wasn't debated. It was handed down. But when printing arrived, something cracked. Because now there wasn't just a truth. There were versions. Ideas could be compared. Beliefs could be tested. History could be rewritten by someone else. The printed world taught people to doubt, to ask, what if the king is wrong? What if the stars don't move around us? What if the earth spins? This wasn't just progress. It was chaos. It was liberating. It was terrifying. Suddenly, truth had to compete. Books argued with other books. Maps were redrawn. Theology collided with astronomy. And people had to decide for themselves what was real. The world became louder, not just more informed, but more unsettled. It was the beginning of science, of journalism, of secular thought, of identity shaped not by birthright, but by what you believed. The press didn't just change what people read, it changed how they think. Ideas became networks, knowledge became fragmented, and yet more connected than ever. A scientist in Prague could test a theory written in Venice. A philosopher in Amsterdam could refute a law passed in Spain. People were no longer isolated. They were arguing in ink. And with that came a new kind of power. Interpretation, skepticism, individual thought. You no longer needed permission to speak. You needed paper, but this rewriting came with weight. It bred confusion, polarization. Voices grew louder and not always wiser. Truth became a battlefield, and for every idea that opened a mind, another sought to control it. Still, the world pressed forward. Printing taught us to live with disagreement, to walk through contradiction, to question and keep questioning. And in that questioning, we began to evolve. We started seeing power not as something inherited, but something earned. We began measuring time not by kings, but by discoveries. We began understanding ourselves, not just through myths, but through memory. A world rewritten wasn't just a slogan, it was a condition, an era, a tension we still live in, where nothing is sacred and everything is worth exploring. Because the moment we learn to print, we also learn to challenge, to examine, to expand, to leave behind the world we were given for one we would forever be rewriting. In the centuries after the press was born, the world became louder. Ideas roared. Empires crumbled. Nations were born from pamphlets. Science battled superstition. Revolutions spun from the curl of a sentence. The noise never stopped. It rose with every printed page. More voices, more claims, more truths. But beneath it all, something quieter persisted. A father reading by candlelight. A mother folding a letter she could barely afford to send. A child tracing the shape of a word with their fingertip, trying to remember. Not to protest, not to argue, but to hold something. A moment, a connection, a whisper. The press changed the world? Yes. But what stayed? What endured? Was something older than revolutions, something softer than ink, something even silence couldn't erase. It was the ritual of reading, the hush of turning a page, the stillness between one line and the next. In monasteries, soldiers whispered psalms. In battlefields, books were tucked into jackets like talismans. In quiet corners, strangers read poems aloud to each other and forgot, for a moment, who they were supposed to be. The world argued louder than ever, but books still asked for the same thing: your time, your stillness, your surrender, not your rage, not your opinion, just your attention and your breath. Even in chaos, especially in chaos, the written word stayed. In ghettos and gulags, in exile and in hiding, in orphanages, in libraries, in prisons, a book didn't need to be shouted, it needed only to be opened. And when it was opened, it did what no decree, no crown, no dogma ever could. It whispered, not do this, not believe this, but come closer. Let me show you something. Even those who tried to silence the press, who burned books, banned papers, shuttered schools, they feared not just the knowledge inside, but the quiet revolution it called for. The one that didn't raise a flag, but raised a question. The one that didn't break chains, but opened eyes. The one that began not with a scream, but a whisper. In every era, someone sat down and wrote something not to change the world, but to remember it, to hold it. To say, I was here, I felt this, I saw you. And somewhere someone else read those words and didn't feel so alone, This was the part that never changed. Not the noise, but the whisper beneath it. Not the headlines, but the margin notes. Not the manifestus, but the letters no one else would ever read. Because when the printing press gave us a way to speak to the world, it also gave us a way to speak to just one person. Across time, across distance, across silence. It let us hold each other in language, even when nothing else could reach. That's why the word endured, not just because it informed or protested or educated, but because it comforted, because it connected, because in a world spinning too fast to hold, a book still asked you to stop and listen. So no matter how loud the future becomes, no matter how many voices fill the sky, no matter how truth bends or doubt grows, there will always be someone reading quietly, in a room no one sees, turning a page, and understanding this was never just a book. The printing press did more than put ink on paper. It sparked a chain reaction, one that never stopped. From the first page carved in metal to the billionth voice online, every step of progress has walked in the shadow of that first imprint. It didn't just change how we share ideas, it changed who gets to speak. It changed what we believe power looks like. Not a sword, not a crown, but a sentence, a thought, a question. That's how knowledge won. Not in battles, but in margins. Not through noise, but through clarity. Every revolution, every right earned, every voice that once had no stage, owes something to that turning point. The press cracked open the silence of the old world and gave rise to one built on argument, insight, learning, a world that never fully agreed, but finally began to listen. And today, we scroll, we click, we post. But beneath the noise, the pulse is the same. We are still driven by words, by the need to understand, to tell our story before someone else writes it for us. So when you wonder what difference a page makes, remember this: every freedom we claim, every truth we defend, every future we imagine, began when we stopped waiting for permission and started putting our thoughts in print. The press didn't just rewrite history. It gave us the tools to write what comes next.